The FP-45 Liberator. The U.S. Joint Psychological Warfare Committee designed the FP-45 Liberator in 1942 around one specific marketing pitch that actually convinced General Eisenhower to approve production despite the weapon's genuinely primitive design. Arm 1 million resistance fighters across occupied Europe for roughly the cost of a single battleship. Built almost entirely from stamped sheet metal and zinc die castings by the Guide Lamp Division of General Motors, the single-shot .45 caliber pistol had no rifling, an effective range of barely 8 yards, and costs just $2.10 per unit to manufacture, allowing the entire order of 1 million pistols to be completed in roughly 3 months flat. Each Liberator shipped with a wordless cartoon instruction sheet specifically designed so any resistance fighter, regardless of language, could learn to load, aim, and fire the weapon at a glance, since the pistol's real purpose was to let its user kill an occupying soldier at point-blank range and steal his considerably more effective rifle. General Eisenhower himself reportedly grew skeptical of the entire concept once actual production wrapped up, questioning whether airdropping crude, largely untraceable pistols into occupied territory genuinely justified the scarce transport aircraft and pilots the operation would require compared to simply dropping bombs on more conventional military targets instead. Ultimately, only a fraction of that massive production run ever reached actual resistance fighters, with roughly 25,000 delivered to the French resistance and about 100,000 shipped to China, while the majority sat in storage or were simply destroyed once Allied commanders grew nervous about flooding occupied territory with crude, largely untraceable firearms that carried genuine risk of civilian reprisals if discovered by occupying forces. The Nazi regime's escalating brutality against civilian populations following the 1942 assassination of Reinhard Heydrich reportedly made Allied planners considerably more cautious about distributing the Liberator widely across occupied Europe, fearing that discovery of these crude pistols among ordinary civilians could trigger exactly the kind of collective punishment already being inflicted on resistance-linked communities: the Pancor Jackhammer. Designer John Anderson patented the Pancor Jackhammer in 1987, building a 12-gauge bullpup shotgun around a 10-round revolving cylinder rather than the tube magazine nearly every other combat shotgun of that era relied on for feeding fresh shells into the chamber. That specific cylinder-based feeding system let the entire weapon reload dramatically faster than any tube-fed shotgun, since a shooter could simply swap an entire preloaded cylinder rather than pushing individual shells one at a time through a narrow loading gate. Gas-operated and capable of cycling that entire cylinder at roughly 240 rounds per minute, the Jackhammer promised genuinely revolutionary firepower for a shotgun, an entire cylinder's worth of buckshot deliverable in just seconds without a single manual pump between shots. The design never escaped its own ambitious engineering, though, and Pancor Corporation ultimately built only 3 working prototypes total, with 2 of those 3 destroyed during testing. A genuinely rough track record for a weapon that had already appeared in video games and action movies years before most shooters ever learned it barely existed as a functioning object. That gap between the Jackhammer's outsized pop culture footprint and its almost non-existent real-world production run makes it one of the most recognized silhouettes in firearms history attached to one of the smallest actual production numbers on record. Video game and film prop departments actually reproduce the Jackhammer's distinctive bullpup silhouette far more times than Pancor Corporation ever managed to build the genuine article, meaning millions of people have seen a convincing replica fire on screen despite the real weapon never reaching anything close to that same level of documented working reliability outside a handful of engineering test sessions. The Korobov TKB-022. Soviet designer German Korobov spent much of the 1960s trying to build a genuine replacement for the Kalashnikov AKM, and his TKB-022 series pursued that goal with a bullpup layout built almost entirely from bakelite plastic rather than the wood and stamped steel that defined nearly every rival Soviet rifle of the same era, competing for the exact same military contract. Korobov's design achieved the best barrel length to overall length ratio of any assault rifle built up to that point, packing a 415mm barrel into a rifle just 525mm long overall, and an unusual vertically moving bolt with a U-shaped rammer ejected spent casings straight up through a tube above the barrel. A genuinely clever solution that let the same rifle be fired comfortably from either shoulder. That same mechanical cleverness ultimately doomed the project for mass production, though, since the TKB-022's feed, locking, and ejection systems contained far too many small, delicate parts to survive the harsh field conditions and minimal maintenance Soviet military planners expected any standard infantry rifle to handle without complaint. Despite never reaching mass adoption itself, the TKB-022's basic design philosophy didn't simply vanish either, with some of its underlying engineering solutions reportedly influencing later specialized Russian weapon systems built for elite units decades after Korobov's original prototypes had already been shelved and largely forgotten outside dedicated firearms history circles. The Krummlauf. German engineers developed the Krummlauf, literally curved barrel in German, as an attachment for the Sturmgewehr 44, specifically designed to let a soldier fire around a corner or over the lip of a foxhole without ever exposing their own body to return fire from an entrenched enemy position. That specific tactical problem, engaging a target while remaining almost entirely shielded by cover, had genuinely limited solutions available to infantry before the Krummlauf arrived, since traditional rifles offered no way to bend a bullet's path around a physical obstacle standing directly between a shooter and an enemy soldier dug into a defensive position nearby. The attachment bent the barrel itself at a fixed angle, with variants built at 30, 45, 60, and even a full 90 degrees, paired with a small periscope sight mounted above the bend that let a shooter aim the curved weapon while staying almost completely concealed behind solid cover. Only the mildest 30-degree infantry version ever reached anything resembling real production numbers, since the more dramatically curved variants placed genuinely extreme stress on both the bullet and the barrel itself, with some reports suggesting the sharper bends wore out after only a few hundred rounds fired through the specially stressed steel. A separate tank variant mounted to fire downward and cover the exact blind spot immediately surrounding an armored vehicle where enemy infantry could otherwise approach unseen, addressed a genuinely different tactical problem using that same basic bent barrel concept. German engineers also built a dedicated Krummlauf variant specifically for the MG-42 machine gun alongside the more common STG-44 version, though that heavier machine gun adaptation saw considerably less actual field use than the standard infantry rifle attachment ever managed during the war's final years. If you've ever seen a weapon in a video game and assumed it was made up, that's the kind of real forgotten hardware this channel keeps digging up. Subscribe if you want. The next one explained the same way. The Magpul FMG-9. Magpul co-founder Mike Mayberry unveiled the FMG-9 at the 2008 SHOT Show, building the entire concept around a genuine Glock 17's internal components hidden inside a folding polymer shell that collapsed down into a compact case barely larger than a small lunchbox someone might carry to work every single day without drawing a second glance. That deliberate visual disguise, an ordinary-looking case rather than anything remotely resembling a firearm, formed the entire core appeal of the concept, letting the weapon travel completely unnoticed right up until the exact moment its owner actually needed it deployed and ready to fire. A single button released the mechanism, letting the entire weapon unfold in one motion from that harmless-looking case into a short-barreled stocked pistol-caliber carbine ready to fire. A genuinely dramatic transformation that made the FMG-9 an instant favorite in video games and action films, despite existing as only a single working prototype. Magpul never intended the FMG-9 for actual commercial production, treating the entire project as a proof-of-concept demonstration, rather than a genuine product launch. And the design sat dormant for over a decade before the company finally partnered with ZEV Technologies to revive the underlying concept as the FDC-9 and FDP-9 models sold commercially today. That 13-year gap between the original prototype's debut and any genuinely purchasable version explains why so many shooters recognize the FMG-9's distinctive folding silhouette from games and movies while having no idea the actual gun essentially never existed as a real product during that entire stretch. Mayberry reportedly drew direct inspiration from earlier folding gun concepts built decades before his own design, including the 1980s-era UC-9 and Ares FMG, proving the FMG-9's dramatic fold-and-deploy concept wasn't entirely original, even if Magpul's specific execution genuinely captured public imagination in a way those earlier, far more obscure attempts never quite managed. The XM29 OICW, the U.S. Army's objective individual combat weapon program, set out during the 1990s to build a genuinely new category of infantry rifle, pairing a standard 5.56mm carbine barrel with an integrated 20mm grenade launcher, firing programmable, computer-fused airburst rounds capable of detonating precisely above a target hidden behind cover that would otherwise completely protect that same target from any conventional direct-fire weapon. That airburst capability alone represented a genuinely significant tactical leap forward on paper, letting a single soldier engage an enemy sheltering behind a wall or inside a trench without needing supporting artillery or a separate grenade launcher operator standing nearby. Alliant Tech Systems partnered with Heckler & Koch to build the resulting XM29 prototype around a modified G36 rifle platform, adding a sophisticated computerized targeting sight that calculated exact range to a target and programmed each grenade's detonation point automatically before it ever left the launcher. That ambitious combination of two entirely separate weapon systems into one rifle came at a genuinely brutal weight cost, though, with the finished prototype tipping the scales at nearly 8 kilograms once the full sight, launcher, and battery system were all mounted together, dramatically heavier than any standard infantry rifle a soldier could reasonably carry for an entire patrol. The Army ultimately canceled the full OICW program in the mid-2000s specifically because of that weight problem, though the underlying grenade launcher concept survived on its own as the separate XM25. A standalone weapon system that inherited the airburst technology without needing to also carry an entire rifle bolted to the same frame. Soldiers who actually tested early OICW prototypes reportedly praised the airburst grenade concept's genuine tactical value against enemies hiding behind walls or in trenches, even while consistently flagging the combined weapon's sheer bulk and weight as a fundamental problem. No amount of additional testing or refinement ever fully managed to solve within the program's own budget and timeline. The MTS-255, Russia's TSKI-BSOO Design Bureau in Tula, developed the MTS-255 during the early 1990s, building a 12-gauge shotgun around a genuine 5-round revolving cylinder that swings open to the side and loads exactly like an oversized revolver rather than feeding from any conventional tube or box magazine. Most other shotguns of the same era relied on entirely. That same design bureau had already spent decades building specialized, small-batch Soviet and Russian firearms for hunters and collectors, giving the MTS-255 project genuine institutional expertise in exactly the kind of unconventional mechanical engineering a revolving shotgun cylinder actually demanded. That revolver-style cylinder let a shooter load 5 completely different types of shotgun shells simultaneously, numbering each individual chamber so the operator could manually rotate to a specific loaded shell, buckshot, a slug, or a less lethal round, and select exactly which one fired next entirely at their own discretion. Originally marketed toward Russian hunters, the design also spawned a dedicated tactical variant with a folding stock and polymer furniture intended for law enforcement use, alongside a specialized, less lethal version called the OTs-62 chambered specifically for rubber projectile ammunition. Serial production of the MTs-255 remained genuinely limited throughout its entire run and was reportedly discontinued entirely by the late 2000s, meaning the design today exists mostly as a special order curiosity rather than a weapon most Russian gun owners would ever actually encounter out in the field during an ordinary hunting trip or range visit. The revolver-style cylinder also gave the MT-255 a genuine practical advantage over both pump-action and semi-automatic shotguns in one specific respect, since a shooter could manually select any of the 5 loaded shells at will, rather than being locked into firing whatever round happened to sit next in a fixed feeding sequence. Stray the Gilboa Snake. Israeli manufacturer Silver Shadow built the Gilboa Snake around one genuinely unusual mechanical decision: mounting 2 complete, fully synchronized barrels side by side on a single AR pattern receiver, both firing simultaneously from every single pull of one shared trigger rather than requiring any separate selector switch or secondary firing mechanism. That synchronized dual-barrel engineering represented a genuinely significant departure from how nearly every other modern rifle manufacturer approached increasing a weapon's practical firepower, since competitors almost universally focused on faster cycling actions or larger magazines rather than simply doubling the entire barrel and bolt assembly itself. That twin-barrel configuration effectively doubles a standard rifle's rate of fire without ever touching the underlying trigger mechanism itself, delivering 2 rounds downrange per trigger pull from 2 separate, independently functioning bolt and barrel assemblies mounted in perfect parallel alignment. Built around the same modular philosophy that defines the broader AR-15 platform, the Snake lets an owner swap both barrels together to change caliber entirely, keeping that same doubled firepower concept intact across different chamberings depending on exactly what a given owner's specific application actually calls for. The design remains a genuinely rare sight even among dedicated collectors of unusual firearms, since building and properly synchronizing 2 complete, independently functioning barrel assemblies onto one shared receiver demands a level of manufacturing precision far beyond what a conventional single-barrel rifle ever requires from its own production line. That same gap also says something broader about the entire category of strange, one-off firearms covered throughout this video, since a design's genuine rarity and its actual cultural footprint through games, films, and online discussion often turn out to be almost completely disconnected from one another, with some of history's most recognizable, unusual gun silhouettes tracing back to prototypes numbering in the single digits rather than any meaningful production run most collectors would ever have a real chance of encountering firsthand. Silver Shadow reportedly marketed the Snake specifically toward buyers seeking genuine redundancy as much as raw doubled firepower, since a mechanical failure in one barrel assembly still leaves the second completely independent barrel fully functional. A genuine reliability advantage no single-barrel rifle design can ever technically replicate on its own, regardless of how well built or maintained that single barrel happens to be.